The echo of Samuel Thorne's chisel rang through the dusty streets of Redemption Springs, each strike transforming raw wood into art with the precision that had earned him a reputation as the finest craftsman in the Arizona Territory. But the townsfolk, whispering about his skill with wood, knew nothing of his other reputation, the one he'd earned years ago, when his hands crafted death instead of beauty, when they called him the Phoenix, the deadliest duelist the West had ever known. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his workshop, where he carefully carved intricate patterns into what would become the new church altar. His weathered hands moved with practiced grace, each cut deliberate and sure. Samuel was a tall man, lean but solid, with silver threading through his dark hair at the temples. His simple cotton shirt and leather apron bore the honest stains of his craft, sawdust clinging to him like a second skin. "Mr. Thorne?" Young Jesse. Carter's voice cracked with urgency as he burst through the workshop door. "The Raven Riders are coming. Sheriff Matthews says they've already hit 3 towns up north." Samuel's chisel never hesitated, continuing its steady rhythm. "That so?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying the soft lilt of his Virginia upbringing. Most folks in Redemption Springs knew him as a man of few words, preferring to let his craftsmanship speak for him. "Yes, sir. They burned the bank in Silver Creek, killed 2 men who tried to stop them. Sheriff's gathering men at Miller's saloon." Jesse bounced on his heels, his 13-year-old frame vibrating with nervous energy. Samuel carefully set down his chisel, using a cloth to wipe wood shavings from his calloused hands. "Best run home then, Jesse. Tell your mother to lock the doors." "But ain't you coming to help? Pa says these Raven Riders are the worst gang since the Cooper brothers." Jesse's eyes were wide with fear and excitement. A shadow passed across Samuel's face, brief as a cloud across the sun. He turned back to his work, fingers tracing the half-finished pattern in the wood. Sometimes the best help a man can offer is staying out of the way. "But Mr. Thorne—" "Go on now, Jesse. Your mama will be worried." As the boy's footsteps faded, Samuel's hands stilled on the altar. Through the workshop window, he could see townsfolk hurrying about, some heading toward the saloon, others rushing home to bar their doors. 5 years he'd been in Redemption Springs, building a life measured in joints and dovetails rather than notches on a gun. 5 years of peace, of creating instead of destroying. He glanced at the hidden compartment beneath his workbench, where a worn gun belt lay wrapped in oiled cloth. The ivory-handled Colt within hadn't seen daylight since he'd arrived in town, since he'd traded the reputation of the Phoenix for that of a simple carpenter. They'd called him that because he always rose from the ashes of his gunfights, they said, but the truth was darker. It was because he could reduce a man to ashes with 3 shots or less, precise as a surgeon's knife. The workshop door creaked, open again, this time revealing Rachel Sullivan, the owner of the town's general store. She was a handsome widow of 35, with keen eyes that saw more than most. "Samuel," she said softly, "the sheriff's asking for every able man." "I'm just a carpenter, Rachel." She stepped closer, her skirts rustling against the sawdust-covered floor. "Are you? There's been talk, you know, travelers passing through, old-timers who remember stories. They say there was a duelist once, fastest gun west of the Mississippi. They say he could kill a man with 3 shots before the poor soul could even clear leather." Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Lots of stories in the West, most of them just wind and dust. "Maybe," Rachel agreed, moving to stand beside his workbench. "But I've watched you these past 5 years. Watched how you measure twice, before cutting once, how your hands never shake, how your eyes track everything that moves. Those aren't just carpenter's habits, are they?" Before he could answer, gunshots erupted from the direction of the saloon. Through the window, they could see 3 riders charging down the main street, their black dusters billowing behind them. Leading them was a man Samuel recognized from wanted posters, Marcus "Mad Dog" Monroe, leader of the Raven Riders. "Samuel," Rachel's voice held both plea and command, "the town needs you." He stood slowly, his eyes never leaving the scene outside. "What this town needs is peace, Rachel. Peace and quiet and things that last. Sometimes," she said softly, "peace has to be built on the ashes of violence." Ashes. Samuel's hands clenched on the workbench, his knuckles white. More shots rang out, followed by screams. "If I do this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's no going back. The man they called the Phoenix, he wasn't just a fast gun. He was a killer, pure and simple." Rachel's hand found his arm, her touch steady and sure. "No, he was a man who did what needed doing, just like you're going to do now." Samuel closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of his past and present balanced on a knife's edge. When he opened them again, something had changed in his gaze. The peaceful carpenter was still there, but now there was something else too, something that spoke of gun smoke and cemetery dirt. "Get the women and children to the church," he said quietly. "Bar the doors. Whatever you hear, don't come out until it's quiet." Rachel nodded, understanding the choice he'd made. As she turned to leave, she paused. "Samuel, thank you." He didn't answer, already moving to the hidden compartment that held his past. The gun belt felt both foreign and familiar as he buckled it on, the weight of it settling against his hip like a long-forgotten sin. Outside, Mad Dog Monroe's voice boomed through the street. "Come on out, folks! Time to contribute to the Raven Riders Retirement Fund!" Samuel Thorne stood in his workshop, surrounded by the things he'd built, the life he'd created. Then he reached for the door, ready to become what he'd once been, one last time. The Phoenix was about to rise again, and Redemption Springs would never be the same. The Miller's saloon doors burst open as three riders strutted in, spurs jingling against the wooden floor. Their leader, Marcus Mad Dog Monroe, cut an imposing figure even among his rough company. His black duster was adorned with brass buttons that caught the lamplight, and a pair of custom-made Colts rode low on his hips. "Evening, folks." Monroe's voice carried the false charm of a circus barker. "Hope we ain't interrupting anything important." His eyes scanned the nervous faces of the patrons, noting the absence of the town sheriff. "Just thought we'd sample some of your fine whiskey." Behind the bar, Rachel Sullivan kept her voice steady. "We serve paying customers here, Mr. Monroe." Monroe's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now that ain't particularly hospitable, Miss Rachel, especially since me and my boys rode so far to pay your fine establishment a visit." He moved to the bar with the casual menace of a mountain lion, his men spreading out to cover the room. The saloon had grown deathly quiet, save for the creaking of floorboards under nervous feet. Monroe reached into his duster, causing several patrons to flinch, but withdrew only a gold coin which he spun across the bar top. "There's your payment. Now, how about that whiskey?" Rachel's hand trembled slightly as she set out a bottle and glass. Monroe poured himself a generous measure, raising it in a mock toast before downing it in one swallow. "Fine whiskey indeed. Though I hear your establishment's been having some trouble lately. Protection ain't what it used to be, what with Sheriff Matthews being stretched so thin." He poured another drink. "Shame if anything were to happen. Fire is particularly dangerous in these wooden buildings." He snapped his fingers for emphasis. "What do you want?" Rachel's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Just to offer our services. Ma'am, small weekly payment, my boys make sure nothing unfortunate occurs. Simple as that." The sound of wood being worked from the carpenter's shop drew Monroe's attention. "What's that racket?" One of his men, a scarred fellow called Snake Eyes, peered out the window. "Just some carpenter, boss, still working on that church altar." "Working when decent folks should be paying attention to important business." Monroe's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Snake Eyes, why don't you go explain to our industrious friend the importance of proper timing?" Samuel worked on, seemingly Oblivious to the approaching gunman, the sun had dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. "Hey, Carpenter!" Snake Eye's voice carried the casual cruelty of a man used to being feared. "Time to pack up them tools." Samuel set down his chisel with deliberate care, but didn't turn around. "Evening," he said quietly. "Still got daylight left. Work needs doing." Snake Eye's hand dropped to his holster. "Didn't ask about the daylight. Mad Dog says, stop working. You stop working. Now." Samuel did turn then, his movements unhurried. His eyes, gray as storm clouds, met Snake Eye's with a calm that seemed to unsettle the gunman slightly. "Don't believe I know any Mad Dog, Samuel," he said, "but I do know there's folks in this town who need their church finished. Now, if you'll excuse me." He reached for his chisel. The sound of Snake Eye's gun-clearing leather was like a rattlesnake's warning. "Reach for that chisel. I reach for something meaner. Last man made me draw," Snake Eye said, grinning. "Ain't building nothing no more. In fact, he ain't doing much of anything these days, except pushing up daisies." Samuel straightened slowly, his expression unchanged. "Been my experience," he said softly, "that men who brag about killing tend to have mighty short futures themselves." Something in his tone made Snake Eye's grin falter. The gunman's eyes narrowed, studying Samuel more carefully now. "You got a familiar way about you, Carpenter, like I seen you somewhere before." "Doubt that." Samuel turned back to his work. "I'm just a man who's good with wood." The rest of his words were cut off by shouts from the direction of the saloon. Both men turned to see Monroe himself striding toward them, flanked by his remaining men. "Problem here, Snake Eyes," Monroe called out. "Something ain't right about this one, boss," Snake Eyes said, his eyes still fixed on Samuel. "He reminds me of what?" Monroe stopped a few paces away, looking Samuel up and down with contempt. "Some church-going woodworker who don't know his place?" He turned to the gathering crowd of townsfolk. "Let this be a lesson, folks. When Mad Dog Monroe's conducting business, all other business stops." Samuel picked up a piece of wood, examining it with careful attention. "The Lord's work doesn't stop for any man's business, Mr. Monroe." A dangerous smile played across Monroe's features. "That's so. Well then, perhaps we need a proper demonstration of how things work in my territory." He looked at his men. "Boys, it seems this fine craftsman needs some schooling of his own. Show him what happens to his precious woodwork when he don't listen to reason." Two of the gang members moved toward the partially constructed altar, but before they could take another step, Samuel's quiet voice cut through the evening air like a steel blade. "I wouldn't." The authority in his tone, not loud, not threatening, but carrying weight that seemed to come from somewhere deep and dangerous, made the men hesitate. Even Monroe's smile faltered for a moment. "And why is that, Carpenter?" Monroe's hand moved, closer to his gun. "Are you planning to stop us with that chisel of yours?" Samuel set down the piece of wood with careful precision. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different kind of authority, one that spoke of gun smoke and silent graves. "No, Mr. Monroe, if it comes to that, I'll stop you the same way I stopped the Cooper brothers in Texas, the same way I stopped the Wilson gang in Kansas." He turned, and suddenly his eyes weren't those of a simple carpenter anymore. They were the eyes of someone else entirely, someone who'd seen more than his share of killing grounds. "The same way I stopped every man foolish enough to think a fast gun made him righteous." The crowd had gone deathly silent. Several of Monroe's men exchanged uncertain glances, their hands hovering near their holsters. In the distance, a church. Bell tolled, marking the hour as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. Monroe's face hardened, his earlier amusement replaced by cold calculation. "You're him, ain't you? They said you disappeared after that business in Santa Fe. Said you'd hung up your guns for good." His hand inched closer to his brass-handled Colt. "The Phoenix!" A murmur ran through the crowd. Even those who'd never left Redemption Springs had heard the stories. tales of a duelist so fast he could put 3 shots through a man before the poor soul's hand even touched his weapon. A man who'd never lost a draw, never killed without cause, and one day simply vanished from the frontier. "That was a lifetime ago," Samuel said quietly, his hands still resting on his workbench. "I came here to build things, Mr. Monroe, not destroy them." Funny thing about the past, Monroe's smile returned, but now it held the predatory gleam of a wolf that had cornered its prey. It has a way of catching up to a man no matter how far he runs. "Boys," he called to his men without taking his eyes off Samuel, "looks like we got ourselves a bonus today. The bounty on the Phoenix's head is worth more than this whole miserable town." The gang members spread out, forming a loose circle around Samuel's workshop. The townsfolk began backing away, mothers hurrying their children indoors, men looking anywhere but at the scene unfolding before them. "Last chance, Carpenter," Monroe said, emphasizing the word with mock respect. "Come quiet, or we paint this church altar of yours with something darker than wood stain." Samuel Thorne's eyes scanned the semicircle of gunmen, noting positions, stances, the way each man held himself. Old habits died hard. 8 men, he said quietly, to kill 1 carpenter. "Kill one carpenter?" Monroe laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Way I heard it, you once took down 5 men in Santa Fe without drawing your second gun. Figure 8 might make it sporting." A warm breeze stirred the sawdust at Samuel's feet. From somewhere down the street came the sound of shutters being hurriedly closed, the town battening down for the storm. Everyone could feel coming. "That was a different man," Samuel said, "in a different time." "Different man?" Monroe's voice dripped with mockery. "Let's see just how different. Snake Eyes, check him for iron." Snake Eyes moved forward cautiously, his dark eyes never leaving Samuel's face. He patted down the carpenter's clothes with quick, professional movements. "Nothing," he reported, stepping back. "No weapon." Monroe's eyebrows rose. "The famous Phoenix walking around unarmed? Now that is different." His smile widened. "Makes our job a whole lot easier, don't it, boys?" "I told you," Samuel said, his voice carrying the patience of a man explaining something simple to a child. "I'm just here to build." "Build?" Monroe spat on the ground. "Build what? A life hiding from who you really are, a reputation as some peace-loving carpenter." He stepped closer, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. "Men like us, Thorne, we don't change. We just find new ways to lie to ourselves." Samuel's hands remained steady on his workbench. "Maybe you're right, Mr. Monroe. Maybe we don't. Change." His eyes met Monroe's. "But we can choose. Every day we can choose." "Choice." Monroe laughed. "Only choice you have now is how you want to die, on your feet like the gunfighter you pretend not to be, or on your knees like the coward you've become." A small figure darted out from between 2 buildings. "Mr. Thorne?" Jesse Carter's voice rang out. "I brought help, I brought— Jesse, get back!" Samuel's command cracked like a whip, freezing the boy in his tracks. In the same instant, Monroe's gun appeared in his hand, aimed not at Samuel but at the child. "Well, well," Monroe drawled. "Seems we got some motivation after all." Samuel's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Something cold that made Snake Eyes take another step back. "Let the boy go," Samuel said quietly. "This is between us." "Between us?" Monroe's gun remained trained on Jesse. "Everything's between all of us, Thorne. Every choice, every consequence. You want to protect this town, these people? Then it's time to show them who you really are." The evening shadows had grown longer, painting stark lines across the dusty street. From the saloon doorway, Rachel Sullivan watched with growing horror, her hands clasped over her mouth. Several of the townsfolk had gathered at windows and doorways, drawn by the confrontation but too afraid to intervene. Sheriff Matthews was nowhere to be seen. likely out checking the outlying farms after the initial warning about the Raven Riders. Samuel knew there would be no help coming from that quarter. This was between him and the ghosts he'd tried to leave behind. "You know, Thorne?" Monroe drew out his words, gun still trained on Jesse. "I heard tell of how you quit the gun game. Story goes that you walked away after that mess in Santa Fe. Something about a woman and a child." He smiled as Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Hit a nerve, did I?" "That's enough," Samuel said, his voice carrying a warning that made several of Monroe's men shift nervously. "Oh, but it ain't nearly enough," Monroe continued. "See, I knew that woman's brother, man you killed in that shootout, James Hawkins. He was kin to me by marriage." His eyes glittered dangerously. "Guess you could say this reunion was meant to be." Samuel's expression remained neutral, but his mind raced back to that terrible day in Santa Fe, the shootout that had left 5 men dead, including young Hawkins, who'd been barely more than a boy himself. It had been a fair fight, all of them calling him out together, but the boy's sister, her face as she cradled her dead brother, that was what had finally made Samuel Thorne hang up his guns, or so he'd thought. "Jesse," Samuel said, his voice gentle but firm, "close your eyes, son." The boy trembled but obeyed, squeezing his eyes. "Shut." In that same moment, Samuel's hand moved. It wasn't a dramatic movement, no flourish, no warning. One moment his hand was empty, the next it held a small derringer that had been concealed in his carpenter's apron. The shot cracked across the street like lightning. Monroe's gun went spinning from his hand, a neat hole drilled through the cylinder. Before the weapon hit the ground, Samuel had already shifted his aim, the tiny derringer somehow now pointing at both Snake Eyes and another gang member simultaneously. "That's one," Samuel said quietly. The street had gone absolutely still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Monroe still stared at his damaged gun, then at his bleeding hand, his face a mask of disbelief. "Impossible," he whispered. "A derringer at that distance." "Jesse," Samuel called out, never taking his eyes off the gunman. "Open your eyes and walk backwards, slow and steady. Your pa's waiting behind Anderson's store." The boy did as he was told, his boots scraping against the dusty street as he retreated. None of Monroe's men dared move to stop him. "Now then," Samuel continued, his voice still quiet, but carrying clearly in the silence, "we can do this one of 2 ways. You can gather up your wounded pride and your wounded hand, Mr. Monroe, and ride out of Redemption Springs. Or we can see if the stories about me are really true." Monroe's face contorted with rage. "You think one lucky shot with a pocket gun makes you the man you used to be? Boys," he bellowed to his men, $100 extra to whoever puts a bullet in this Carpenter." Guns appeared in hands all around the semicircle. Samuel didn't appear concerned. If anything, a hint of sadness crossed his features. "The derringer was for the boy's sake," he said softly. "Didn't want him to see what's coming next." His free hand moved to his carpenter's belt, fingers closing around something that had looked like a common tool to all who'd seen him work. But as he pulled it free, the last rays of sunlight caught the metalwork that had been carefully disguised beneath wood shavings and sawdust. A Colt Peacemaker, its barrel modified, its grip worn smooth by years of use. The gun that had made. "Infamous, sweet Jesus," Snake Eyes breathed. "It's true, it's all true." "Last chance," Samuel said, the Colt hanging loose but ready at his side. "Ride out. Live to see tomorrow." "Take him," Monroe screamed, reaching for his backup gun with his uninjured hand. The street erupted in gunfire. Later, witnesses would argue about exactly what happened next. Some swore Samuel Thorne didn't move at all, that his gun seemed to fire of its own accord. Others insisted they saw him dance between the bullets like a man blessed by God himself. The only thing they all agreed on was the precision, the terrible, beautiful precision. 3 shots rang out, distinct even in the chaos. 3 shots, just like the story said. When the smoke cleared, 3 of Monroe's men lay writhing in the dust, each clutching a shattered gun hand. 3 more stood frozen, their weapons somehow knocked from their grips by shots that had seemed to come from impossible angles. Snake Eyes and the remaining man had their guns on the ground and their hands raised before Samuel even turned to face them. Only Monroe remained, his backup gun halfway cleared from its holster, his face a mask of pure hatred. "You're still the same killer you always were," he snarled. "All this carpentry, all this pretending, you can't build anything. That'll bury who you really are." Samuel's gun hadn't moved. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Monroe. I am what I am, but every man gets to choose what he builds with the tools God gave him." His eyes hardened. "I chose to build homes, futures, places where people can worship. In peace, you chose to tear things down. That's the only difference that matters." Monroe's gun hand twitched. "Pretty words," he spat. "Let's see if they stop bullets." His draw was fast, blindingly fast, the kind of speed that had left dozens of men dead in streets across the frontier. But Samuel Thorne hadn't earned his nickname by being slow. 3 shots rang out in rapid succession, so close together they almost sounded like one. Monroe's gun went spinning away, his gun belt suddenly separated from its holster, and his hat lifted cleanly from his head. 3 shots, Samuel said quietly, just like always. 1 to disarm, 1 to disable, 1 to remind. He stepped forward, his gun unwavering. "I haven't killed a man in 5 years, Mr. Monroe. Don't make me start counting fresh today." Monroe stood frozen, blood trickling from a shallow graze on his gun hand. For a long moment, only the distant rumble of thunder broke the silence. Finally, the outlaw leader's shoulders slumped. "It's over, boys," he called to his remaining men. "Mount up." As the gang gathered their wounded and helped them onto horses, Samuel remained still, his gun trained on Monroe. Only when the last rider had mounted did he speak again. "Don't come back to Redemption Springs," he said. "Next time won't be a demonstration." Monroe's face was a study in conflicting emotions, rage, fear, and something that might have been respect. "They'll come for you now," he said. "Every gunfighter and bounty hunter between here and Mexico, the phoenix back from the dead, building churches." He laughed bitterly. "Won't keep them away." "Maybe not." Samuel finally lowered his gun. "But that's tomorrow's problem. Today I've got work to finish." He turned back to his workbench, setting the Colt carefully beside his chisel. Daylight's wasting. The thunder grew closer as Monroe and his men rode out of town, the setting sun casting their shadows long across the street as they disappeared into the gathering dusk. Rachel Sullivan hurried across from the saloon, her skirts rustling in the evening breeze. "Mr. Thorne," she said softly, we had no idea. All this time." "No reason you should have, Miss Rachel," Samuel replied, already turning back to his workbench. But she caught his arm, making him pause. "My brother," she said softly. "He used to ride with a gang before he found his way back to God. Said he once saw the Phoenix in action in Kansas Territory. Said he was like nothing he'd ever seen. Fastest gun anybody ever knew. But he never drew first and never killed without cause." Her eyes searched his face. "Said he was a legend." Samuel gently removed her hand from his arm. "Legends have a way of growing bigger than the men they're about, Miss Rachel. Your brother sounds like he found his way to something better." "But you're not a legend anymore," she insisted. "You're part of Redemption Springs now. Those men, they'll be back or others will come. You can't just pretend today didn't happen." Samuel picked up his chisel, its weight familiar and comforting in his hand. "I'm not pretending anything, just choosing what kind of man I want to be, one day at a time." "Mr. Thorne," Jesse's voice came from behind him, small but steady. Are you really him, the Phoenix?" Samuel turned to find not just Jesse, but what seemed like the whole town emerging from their hiding places, looking at him with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. "I was," he said simply. "Now I'm just a carpenter. one who'd appreciate some help finishing this altar before the storm hits. He held out a spare chisel. Want to learn how to build something? The boy's face lit up as he took the tool and, slowly, others began stepping forward. Men and women who'd hidden from the gunfight, now offering their hands to help build. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, the sound of work filled the air once more. Sheriff Matthews finally returned, as the last details were being carved, taking in the scene of townsfolk working together with obvious surprise. Heard there was trouble, the sheriff said, approaching Samuel. Heard the Phoenix handled it. Samuel drove another nail home before answering. No trouble, Sheriff. Just some men who needed reminding that Redemption Springs isn't the kind of town they're looking for. And the Phoenix? The sheriff's voice was careful. He's still retired? Just a carpenter here, Samuel said firmly. Nothing more. Might not be that simple, Matthews warned. Word will spread. Men with something to prove, bounty hunters looking to make a name. Then they'll find a carpenter, Samuel replied, unless they force him to be something else. He paused in his work, meeting Matthew's eyes. But I'd appreciate your help in making sure it doesn't come to that. The sheriff considered this, then extended his hand. Welcome to Redemption Springs, Mr. Thorne. Officially. As they shook hands, the storm finally broke overhead, rain pattering on the partially finished altar, but no one made a move to leave. The gun remained on Samuel's workbench, slowly gathering sawdust, a tool he hoped would stay unused, but never far from reach. After all, a good carpenter knew that sometimes the right tool made all the difference between building something that would last and watching it all come crashing down. The rain continued to fall as the townsfolk worked together, transforming the altar from mere wood into something more, not just a piece of church furniture, but a symbol of the kind of future Samuel Thorne had chosen to build. With each strike of his chisel, he drove another nail into the coffin of his old life, hoping it would stay buried this time. But even as he worked, he couldn't help but remember Monroe's parting words. They'll come for you now. And deep down, Samuel knew the outlaw was right. The past had a way of finding you, no matter how many new foundations you tried to build over it. Still, that was tomorrow's problem. Today, there was work to be done, a community to build, and maybe, just maybe, a chance at redemption, one piece of craftwork at a time. Word travels fast in the West. By the time the sun rose over Redemption Springs the next morning, riders were already spreading the news across 3 territories. The Phoenix had risen again. Samuel wiped sweat from his brow as he worked on the church altar's final details, the morning sun already burning hot. Below, Jesse Carter handed up tools and wood, having appointed himself the carpenter's unofficial apprentice. Mr. Thorne, Jesse called up. There's riders coming. Samuel didn't pause his work, but his eyes flicked to the workbench where his colt rested beneath a layer of sawdust. How many? Just 2. Looked like regular folks, not like Monroe's men. And a woman in black. The riders approached at an unhurried pace. A man and woman, their horses trail-worn. The woman wore a black dress, her face hidden beneath a dark veil. Samuel's hands stilled on the wood as recognition hit him like a physical blow. Catherine Hawkins, he breathed. Jesse looked up, confused. You know them, Mr. Thorne. Get inside the church, Jesse. Now. The boy hesitated only a moment before obeying, recognizing the tone in Samuel's voice, the same tone from yesterday, right before the shooting started. Samuel climbed down from the altar with deliberate care, dusting off his hands as the riders drew up in front of the church. The man he didn't recognize, tall, well-dressed, with the look of a territorial judge about him. But the woman. She dismounted without assistance, her movements graceful despite her mourning clothes. When she lifted her veil, her face was exactly as Samuel remembered it, beautiful, proud, and carved with grief that 5 years hadn't softened. Hello, Samuel, she said quietly. Mrs. Hawkins. He inclined his head slightly. Long way from Santa. V. It's Mrs. Bradford now. She gestured to her companion, who'd also dismounted. My husband, Judge William Bradford of the Territorial Court. Samuel's expression didn't change, but something cold settled in his stomach. He'd wondered when the law would finally catch up to him. Bradford stepped forward, his manner professional but not unfriendly. Mr. Thorne, your reputation precedes you. Does it? Samuel turned back to his work. I'm just a carpenter now. So we heard, Catherine said, an edge creeping into her voice. Building churches, living a quiet life. Tell me, do you sleep well? At night, Mr. Thorne, do the faces of the men you've killed haunt your dreams? Samuel set down his chisel carefully. Every night, ma'am. Your brothers most of all. James was 20, she said, her composure cracking slightly. Barely more than a boy. A boy who called me out along with 4 other men, Samuel replied quietly. A boy who drew first and shot to kill. He was avenging our father. Catherine's voice rose. Your father drew on me over a card game he was cheating at, Samuel said, his voice remaining level. I gave him every chance to walk away. Judge Bradford cleared his throat. Mr. Thorne, we're not here about past grievances. We're here about Mad Dog Monroe. Samuel turned to face them fully now. What about him? He's been terrorizing settlements across 3 territories, Bradford explained. Robbery, extortion, murder. The territorial government wants him stopped, but he's proven elusive, until yesterday when the Phoenix came out of retirement. Understanding dawned. You want me to hunt him? Bradford nodded. With proper authority, of course, a U.S. Marshal's badge, full backing of the law. And a chance to make amends, Catherine said softly, to use your skills for justice instead of just adding to the body count. Samuel looked at his church altar, at the fresh-cut wood waiting to be transformed into something meaningful. I left that life behind, did you? Catherine stepped closer. Or are you just hiding from it? Yesterday proved you haven't changed, Samuel. You're still the same man who can end a fight with 3 shots. The only difference is whether you use that skill for something worthwhile. Building a church is worthwhile, Samuel countered. Building a church while men like Mad Dog Monroe destroy other communities? Bradford asked. How many churches will he burn? How many lives will he ruin while you play at Reformation? Before Samuel could respond, the sound of approaching hooves drew their attention. Sheriff Matthews rode up, his expression concerned. Samuel, he called out. Got word from Copper Creek. Monroe's gang hit them last night, burned half the town, killed 4 men who tried to stand up to them. He noticed the visitors. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. You didn't, Samuel said grimly. How many dead total? 6, including a boy about Jesse's age who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Catherine's face paled. Another child. Another life cut short because violent men are allowed to roam free. She turned to Samuel. How many more, Mr. Thorne? How many more deaths will you allow while you hide behind your carpenter's apron? Samuel walked to his workbench, running his fingers over the worn wood. You're right about one thing, Mrs. Bradford. I haven't changed, not really. He brushed away the sawdust covering his colt. I'm still the man who can't walk away when there's killing to be stopped. He picked up the gun, checking it with practiced movements that 5 years hadn't dulled. But you're wrong about something else. I'm not hiding from who I am. I'm trying to be more than just a killer. Then be more, Bradford said, producing a marshal's badge from his coat. Be the law. Samuel stared at the badge for a long moment. If I do this, if I put on that badge, I do it my way. No posses, no civilian casualties, no collateral damage, just me hunting them clean. Bradford nodded. Those are exactly the terms we were hoping for. Your reputation for precision is why we sought you out. And afterward? Samuel asked. When Monroe's dealt with? Afterward, you can go back to building your church, Bradford promised, with a full pardon for any outstanding warrants from your In previous activities, Catherine stepped forward again, but this time there was something different in her expression. Not quite forgiveness, but perhaps understanding. James made his choice that day in Santa Fe. I've had 5 years to accept that maybe it's time we both stop letting the ghosts of the past determine our futures. Samuel holstered his gun with fluid grace, muscle memory unchanging despite the years. "Jesse," he called out, "you can come out now." The boy emerged from the G-Stone church, eyes wide with excitement. "Are you going after Monroe, Mr. Thorne?" "Looks that way." Samuel turned to Sheriff Matthews. "I'll need someone to oversee the altar construction while I'm gone. Make sure it's done right." Matthews nodded. "I'll see to it personally." Samuel knelt down to Jesse's level. "Think you can help the sheriff? Show him everything I taught you. About proper joinery and wood grain." Jesse straightened proudly. "Yes, sir, Mr. Thorne." "Good boy." Samuel stood, accepting the badge from Bradford and pinning it to his vest. The weight of it felt strange, both foreign and familiar, like the gun on his hip. "I'll need to make some preparations," he said. "Get my old gear from storage." "We've heard Monroe's headed south," Bradford informed him. "Our sources suggest he has connections with the Martinez brothers cartel." Samuel nodded grimly. "Gun runners. They control the weapons trade from El Paso to Chihuahua. Dangerous men." "You know them?" Catherine asked. Samuel's eyes took on a distant look. "Crossed paths with them in '69. They were smaller then, just starting to build their empire. Had a disagreement over some merchandise they were selling to Apache renegades." "What kind of disagreement?" Bradford pressed. "The kind that left Miguel with a limp and Carlos with one less brother." Samuel checked his ammunition. "They won't have forgotten." "No," Samuel said with quiet certainty. "A man like that, wounded, in his pride, he's not running, he's gathering allies. He'll be back and he'll bring an army with him." He looked at Catherine. "You might want to be well clear of Redemption Springs when that happens." Catherine met his gaze steadily. "I've spent 5 years running from the violence that took my brother and father. Maybe it's time I stopped running too." Sheriff Matthews spared no time spreading the word. Within hours, telegrams raced across the wires to every settlement within. 50 miles, the Phoenix was hunting, and anyone who stood with Monroe would face the same justice. The message was simple, but its implications sent ripples through the territory like stones cast in still water. Samuel Thorne had his own preparations to make. The morning air was crisp and clean as he walked to his modest cabin on the edge of town, the rough-hewn structure a testament to his newer, simpler life. Inside, the morning light filtered through cotton curtains Rachel had insisted on hanging last spring, casting gentle patterns across the plank floor he'd laid himself. He knelt beside his bed, fingers finding the hidden catch he'd built into the floorboards. The wood lifted away silently, revealing a worn leather case he hadn't opened in 5 years. The brass key still hung around his neck, a constant reminder of the man he'd been and the man he'd chosen to become. Each morning when dressing, he'd felt its weight, like a small anchor to his past. Inside the case, nestled in well-oiled cloth, lay the tools of his former trade. A second Colt, twin to the one on his hip, its bluing worn in exactly the same places. The custom ammunition, special ordered from Heinrich Schmidt in St. Louis, each bullet hand-loaded to his exact specifications. A folded leather map, its creases, deep from years of use, marked with hideouts, water sources, and danger spots across 3 territories. The geography of a violent life written in careful ink. But it was the item at the bottom that gave him pause. Wrapped in soft cloth, a silver pocket watch caught the morning light. Samuel unwrapped it carefully, his calloused fingers tracing the inscription inside. "To my son, Samuel, may you always know when to stand and when to walk away." "Father, your father was a lawman." Catherine Bradford's voice came from the doorway. She stood there, silhouetted against the morning light, her black dress a stark contrast to the warm wood tones of his cabin. "Texas Ranger," Samuel replied, not looking up. "Died trying to reason with desperate men, like father, like son." There was an edge to her voice, but something else too, curiosity, perhaps even understanding. He believed every man deserved a chance to choose right over wrong. Samuel carefully rewrapped the watch. Even when they'd chosen wrong before. "Is that why you gave James a chance?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Before Samuel could answer, Rachel Sullivan appeared behind Catherine, carrying a package wrapped in oilcloth. "Mr. Thorne," she called out, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed to push back the morning chill. "Before you go." She stepped into the cabin, nodding politely to Catherine as she passed. The package, when unwrapped, revealed a gun belt. The leather was well-oiled and supple, worked with intricate patterns that spoke of both artistry and function. "It was Michael's," Rachel explained softly, referring to her late husband. "He'd want you to have it, said you were the only man he ever saw who truly understood that a gun was meant to protect, not destroy." Samuel ran his fingers over the tooled leather, reading the story of its craftsmanship. "Your husband was a wise man, Miss Rachel. He also said," she continued, a slight flush coloring her cheeks, "that if anything ever happened to him, I should find someone who built things up instead of tearing them down." Her eyes met his, carrying meaning beyond the words. "Just come back to us, Samuel. There's more here worth building than just a church." The moment was interrupted by Jessie Carter, bursting through the door out of breath. "Mr. Thorne, riders coming in from the south, look like Mexican bandits." The news spread through town like wildfire, bringing concerned townsfolk to their doors and windows. Samuel held up a hand for quiet, his presence immediately commanding. "Attention." "How many, Jessie?" "3, but they're carrying a white flag." The boy's eyes were wide with excitement and fear. Samuel exchanged meaningful glances with Sheriff Matthews and Judge Bradford, who had appeared at the commotion. "Could be a trap," Matthews warned, his hand resting on his gun. "Could be an opportunity," Bradford countered, ever the diplomat. "They're here to test us," Samuel said firmly, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him legend, "to see how we respond to a peaceful approach." He checked his gun out of habit, then deliberately removed the gun belt. "So, let's show them something they don't expect." Rachel caught his arm as he headed for the door, her touch sending warmth through his sleeve. "Samuel, you're not going out there unarmed." He smiled slightly, the expression softening his weathered features. "I'm not unarmed, Rachel. I've got the whole town behind me." In a lower voice, he added, "But have Jesse get up in the church tower with his father's spyglass, just in case." The Mexican riders had stopped at the edge of town, their white flag snapping in the morning breeze. Samuel walked out to meet them, his carpenter's hammer serving as a walking stick. The townsfolk watched from every vantage point, breath held collectively as their defender approached the potential threat. The lead rider was young, barely more than a boy, but he sat his horse with the practiced arrogance of youth in service to power. His companions flanked him, hands never far from their weapons, despite the white flag they carried. "You are Thorne, the Phoenix?" The young Mexican's accent was thick but clear. "I'm Samuel Thorne," he replied with deliberate casualness, "builder of churches and enforcer of laws. Something I can help you with?" The conversation that followed was a careful dance of words and implications, of offers made and rejected, of power tested and boundaries drawn. When it was done, when the riders had galloped away carrying their message back to Martinez, Samuel turned to find the town had gathered behind him. Rachel met him halfway, concern mixed with admiration in her eyes. "That was quite a performance," she said softly, "but you just painted a target on yourself." "Target Target was already there, he replied, looking at the church he'd built with his own hands. Just made sure they know hitting it won't be easy. His eyes swept the gathered crowd, noting faces both frightened and determined. Besides, some things are worth the risk. As the townsfolk dispersed, Catherine Bradford approached him. "You're not what I expected," she admitted. "When I came here seeking the Phoenix, I thought I'd find a killer hiding behind a carpenter's apron. Instead, I found a builder who happens to know how to fight." She smiled slightly. "My brother would have appreciated the irony." Samuel looked at her thoughtfully. "Your brother was a good man, Mrs. Bradford. He just chose the wrong path to prove it." "And what path are you choosing now, Mr. Thorne?" He turned to watch Jesse organizing the younger children to act as lookouts, teaching them the signals he'd learned in the church tower. "The only path I know," he said quietly. "Building something worth defending, then defending it with everything I have." The morning sun climbed higher over Redemption Springs, glinting off windows and tools alike. Samuel Thorne walked back to his work, his hammer in his hand, his gun in its new holster. He'd meant what he said to the riders. He wasn't just a shooter anymore, or even just a builder. He was becoming something new, something the frontier hadn't seen before, a man who could raise walls and defend them, who could teach peace while preparing for war. And if Martinez wanted to test that strength, well, Samuel smiled grimly. Some lessons had to be taught the hard way. The weight of his father's watch pressed against his chest, reminding him of choices made and yet to come. When to stand and when to walk away, the inscription had said. Maybe this was both, standing for what was right by walking away from what was easy. The true test would come soon enough, and Redemption Springs would need every bit of strength its name implied. 2 weeks after the Mexican rider's visit, Samuel stood in his workshop behind the church, carefully shaping a piece of oak. The emerging rifle stock took form under his skilled hands, each stroke of the plane precise and purposeful. Through the window, he could see townspeople going about their morning routines, but there was a new wariness in their movements, a tension. "In the air as thick as summer heat. Didn't know you made weapons too." Rachel's voice came from the doorway. She carried her usual morning coffee, but her expression was troubled. "Thought you were done with that part of your life." "Not weapons," Samuel corrected softly. "Tools for the new deputies." He held up the stock, showing the subtle curves. "A well-made rifle is like a well-made beam, has to be strong in the right places, balanced just so." More riders came in. "Last night," she said, setting down the coffee and moving closer. "Sheriff Matthews says they were watching the South Road, testing our defenses." "I know." Samuel blew sawdust from the wood grain. "Jesse's father counted 6 of them from the church tower. They're getting bolder, or more desperate." Rachel's hand touched his arm, stilling his work. "Samuel, there's something you need to know. The supply wagon from Mesa Verde was robbed yesterday, 3rd one this month." He set down his tools carefully. "Anyone hurt?" "No, but the driver said the bandits knew exactly what they were looking for. Building materials, ammunition, even the school books we ordered." Her voice hardened. "Martinez is trying to strangle us, just like you predicted." Samuel moved to his workbench, unrolling a map he'd been annotating. "Look here. Every raid, every sighting forms a pattern. He's not just cutting supply lines, he's isolating us, making sure we can't get help when the real attack comes." A knock at the workshop door interrupted them. Judge Bradford entered, followed by his wife Catherine and Sheriff Matthews. The judge carried a stack of papers that Samuel recognized as legal documents. "We've got trouble," Bradford announced without preamble. "Just got word from the territorial capital. Someone's challenging our water rights for the town." "Martinez has friends in high places," Matthews added grimly. "They're claiming the original charter wasn't properly filed." Samuel turned back to his workbench, running his fingers over the half-finished rifle stock. "So that's his game. Use the law against us, just like we used it against Monroe." There's more, Catherine said. The outlying farms, their families, are talking about leaving. They're scared, Samuel, scared of what's coming, scared. The morning sun streamed through the workshop windows, catching dust motes and highlighting the projects in various stages of completion: gun stocks, furniture repairs, town defenses. All of it building towards something larger, something Martinez was trying to tear down without firing a shot. He won't succeed, Samuel said quietly, but with iron certainty. Redemption Springs is stronger than he thinks. Strength might not be enough this time, Bradford warned. We need a plan, something that... The judge was cut off as Jesse burst into the workshop, his young face flushed with excitement. Mr. Thorne, you've got to come quick. There's someone asking for you at Miller's saloon. Samuel frowned. Someone? A man from Santa Fe. Jesse's eyes were wide. Says he knew you before, when you were the Phoenix. The adults exchanged sharp looks. Rachel's grip tightened on Samuel's arm, and Catherine's hand went to her throat. Did he give a name? Samuel asked carefully. Called himself Martinez, Jesse said. Miguel Martinez. Samuel's mind raced back 6 years, to a night of gunfire and blood in a Santa Fe alley. Miguel Martinez had been younger then, just starting to build his criminal empire. The limp he now carried was a reminder of their last meeting. Samuel! Rachel's voice held warning and concern. This has to be a trap. Of course it is, he agreed, reaching for his gun belt. But sometimes the best way to spring a trap is to walk right into it. Not alone, Sheriff Matthews said firmly. I'll get my deputies. No. Samuel checked his gun with practiced efficiency. Martinez is here to take my measure, see if I'm still the man he remembers. Too many guns will only guarantee bloodshed. And one gun won't? Catherine asked sharply. Samuel allowed himself a small smile. Depends on how it's used. He turned to Jesse. Get up in the church tower. If you see more riders approaching town, ring the bell 3 times. Yes, sir. The boy darted away, proud to have an important task. Rachel, Samuel continued, get word to the shopkeepers. Nobody sells supplies to any strangers today. Judge those water rights papers. How long can you tie them up in court? A few weeks, maybe a month. Do it. We need time to prepare. He buckled on his gun belt, the weight familiar yet strange after so many peaceful mornings. Catherine, your husband's position might shield you from what's coming. You should consider leaving town. She lifted her chin defiantly. I told you before, I'm done running from violence. Samuel nodded, respecting her decision. He picked up his Carpenter's hammer, tucking it into his belt alongside his gun. At Rachel's questioning look, he explained, sometimes the best weapon is the one they don't expect you to use. The walk to Miller's saloon seemed longer than usual. Word of Miguel Martinez's arrival had spread quickly, and townsfolk found reasons to be on the street, watching. Some nodded to Samuel as he passed, others hurried inside, but all of them understood that this meeting would determine their future. Inside the saloon, the morning light filtered through dusty windows, illuminating a solitary figure seated at a corner table. Miguel Martinez had aged well, his black hair now streaked with distinguished gray, his clothes expensive and well cut. Only the silver-headed cane leaning against his chair betrayed the injury from their last encounter. Phoenix, Martinez said softly as Samuel approached. Or should I say, Marshal Thorne, I hear you've acquired new titles since we last met. Miguel. Samuel remained standing, his posture relaxed but ready. Long way from Santa Fe. Is it? I would say you're the one who's traveled far, from legendary gunfighter to small-town carpenter. Martinez gestured to the empty chair. Please sit, share a drink with an old acquaintance. We were never acquainted, Miguel, just had a disagreement about business practices. Martinez's smile didn't reach his eyes. Ah, yes, my business practices. You cost me a lot of money that night, Phoenix. Cost me something more valuable, too. He tapped his cane meaningfully. "You were selling guns to raiders who were killing innocent families," Samuel said quietly. "I gave you a chance to walk away. And now?" Martinez spread his hands. "Now you build churches, protect small towns, play at being civilized. Tell me, does it help you sleep at night? Does it wash the blood from your hands?" "I sleep fine," Samuel replied. "How about you? How many families have your guns killed since Santa Fe?" A flash of anger crossed Martinez's face, quickly controlled. "I'm not here to discuss the past. I'm here to offer you a choice, a chance to walk away, just like you once offered me." "This is different. Is it? Look around you, Phoenix. This town, these people, they're nothing. A speck of dust in the territory, but I can offer you something more. Partnership, legitimacy, a chance to be part of the future instead of clinging to these," he waved dismissively, "provincial dreams of yours." Samuel's hand rested casually near his gun. "And if I refuse, then I burn it all." Martinez's voice was soft, almost regretful. "Not just the town, everything you've built, everyone you care about, it's already begun. The supply raids, the water rights challenge, the scared farmers, that's just the start. I have an army gathering in Mexico, guns, money, friends in places. How long do you think your little community can hold out?" "Longer than you think," Samuel said. "These people are stronger than you know." "People are weak," Martinez spat. "They break, they run, they betray. But you were different once. You understood power, understood that strength comes from the gun, not from building pretty churches and playing at redemption." Samuel studied the man before him, seeing not just the powerful crime lord, but the bitter youth he'd once been. "You're wrong, Miguel. True strength isn't in what you can destroy, it's in what you choose to build." Pretty words. Martinez struggled. To his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. "But words won't stop what's coming. You have 1 week, Phoenix. Take my offer, or watch everything you love burn to ashes." He limped toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Phoenix, that boy in the church tower, he looks like he'd make a fine apprentice. Be a shame if something happened to him." Samuel's voice cut through the air like a steel blade. "Threaten that boy again, Miguel, and our next meeting won't end with just a limp." Martinez smiled, but his eyes were cold. 1 week, he repeated, and walked out into the morning sun. The next 5 days in Redemption Springs passed like a fever dream, each moment filled with purpose and dread. Samuel Thorne spent his days turning his carpenter's skills to fortification, his nights teaching townsfolk the arts of defense. The church, once merely a house of worship, was becoming a fortress. "Harder," Samuel instructed, watching Jesse and 3 other boys practice with wooden replicas of guns he'd crafted. "Speed matters less than precision. A fast shot that misses is just noise." Rachel Sullivan watched from the church steps, her face betraying concern. "Should we be teaching children to fight? We're teaching them to survive," Samuel replied quietly. "Martinez won't spare them just because they're young." He demonstrated the proper stance again, his movements fluid from years of practice. "Remember, 3 things make a marksman: breath, balance, and belief. Believe in your aim, and your hand will follow." The town had changed in subtle but significant ways. Samuel's expertise had transformed ordinary buildings into defensive positions. Windows were reinforced, sightlines established, escape routes planned. What looked like simple architectural improvements to outside eyes were carefully designed firing positions and cover points. "Mr. Thorne," Sheriff Matthews called out, approaching with Judge Bradford. "Got word from our scouts. Martinez's men are gathering at the old mission, 20 miles south, at least 40 riders." Samuel nodded grimly. "More will come. He's waiting for something. Or someone," Bradford added. "The territorial governor is due to pass through next week. If Martinez controls Redemption Springs by then..." "He controls the whole Northern Territory," Samuel finished. "That's why he gave us a week. He wants the timing perfect." Catherine Bradford emerged from the church, where she'd been organizing medical supplies. "We could still send for federal troops. They'd never get here in time," Samuel said, "and Martinez has too many friends in high places. We handle this ourselves." As if to emphasize his words, the afternoon quiet was broken by 3 sharp shots from the south. One of their warning stations. Samuel's hand moved to his gun, but the follow-up signal, 2 more shots, indicated scouts, not an attack. "Jesse," Samuel called, "get up in the tower. Rachel, send word through town. Everyone to their positions, just like we practiced." The response was immediate but orderly. Within minutes, the street was clear, except for a few armed men casually going about their business, presenting an image of normalcy while being ready for trouble. 4 riders approached, taking their time, studying the town's layout. Samuel recognized the lead rider, Snake Eyes, one of Monroe's old gang, now apparently working for Martinez. "Afternoon, Phoenix," Snake Eyes called out, reining in his horse. "Nice improvements you've made. Shame they won't help much. Samuel continued working on a window frame, his movements unhurried. "Something I can help you with?" "Just delivering a message. Boss says your time's running out. Wanted to make sure you understand what's coming." Snake Eyes grinned, showing gold teeth. "See, we got some new friends joining us. Comanche warriors, angry about that mission raid last year. Apache renegades looking for revenge, even some of Monroe's old boys, eager to settle scores." "Quite an army," Samuel observed mildly, though his mind was already calculating angles, positions, weaknesses. "More than enough to burn this town to the ground." Snake Eyes leaned forward in his saddle. "But the boss is generous, says there's still time to be reasonable." Samuel set down his hammer, fixing Snake Eyes with a steady gaze. "Strange thing about reasonable men. They don't usually need armies to make their point." "Maybe not," Snake Eyes agreed, "but unreasonable men need something else. Something to lose." He nodded toward the church. "Pretty building, lot of work went into it. Be a shame if—" His words cut off as Samuel's hand moved, faster than seemed possible. The Colt appeared as if by magic, its barrel unwavering. "That's close enough," Samuel said quietly. "You've delivered your message. Now ride out while you still can." Snake Eyes' hand had dropped to his gun, but the cold certainty in Samuel's eyes made him reconsider. "2 days, Phoenix, then we come in force." As the riders departed, Rachel emerged from the store, her face pale but determined. "How many will there be?" "Too many for a straight fight," Samuel admitted, "but we're not planning on fighting fair." He gathered the town's leaders in the church that evening: Sheriff Matthews, Judge Bradford, Catherine, Rachel, and key citizens who'd proven their worth in the preparations. The church altar, still unfinished, served as their planning table. "Martinez expects us to defend the town, traditionally," Samuel explained, pointing to the map he'd drawn. "Strong points, barricades, buildings, that's how it's always done. But we're going to change the rules." He detailed his plan, using his carpenter's knowledge of the town's construction to create advantages no one else would expect. Underground passages, reinforced hideouts, fake buildings that would collapse strategically. Every structure he'd worked on over the past 5 years had been built with this possibility in mind. "The whole town's a trap," Rachel realized, understanding. Dawning in her eyes. "Several traps," Samuel corrected, "each one designed to split their forces, divide their attention. When they think they're winning, that's when we'll have them." "It's risky," Matthews warned. "If anything goes wrong—" "Everything's already wrong," Catherine interrupted. "Martinez won't stop with Redemption Springs. He wants to own the whole territory, turn it into his private kingdom. Someone has to stand against him." "We'll need every advantage," Samuel continued. "Judge, those legal papers you filed, they'll keep Martinez's legitimate businesses occupied?" Bradford nodded. "His Lawyers are tied up in 3 different courts. He'll have to move soon or risk losing everything he's built legally, which makes him dangerous, Catherine added. A man with nothing to lose has everything to prove, Samuel finished. He turned to Rachel. The supplies I asked for? Hidden in the root cellar, just like you said, though I still don't understand why we need so much lamp oil and sawdust. Samuel allowed himself a grim smile. Martinez isn't the only one who knows how to use fire. As the meeting continued, Jesse slipped into the church. Mr. Thorne, there's something you should see. Outside, the setting sun had painted the sky blood red, but it was the dust cloud on the horizon that caught Samuel's attention. Riders, a lot of them, making camp just out of rifle range. They're early, Matthews observed. No, Samuel said quietly. They're right on time. This is Martinez's real message, showing us our death approaching slowly, trying to break our spirits before the fight begins. Rachel's hand found his in the gathering darkness. Will it work? Samuel squeezed her hand gently. Look around. Throughout the town, lights were appearing in windows. Not the nervous flickers of scared people, but the steady glow of determination. On the church tower, Jesse and his friends maintained their watch. From the saloon came the sound of men singing hymns, not in fear, but in defiance. Martinez thinks he's showing us our death, Samuel said, but all I see is a town too stubborn to die, too proud to run, and too well-built to fall. Too well-built. The sunset deepened, painting the town in shades of purple and gold. Samuel Thorne stood with Rachel Sullivan, watching the enemy fires bloom in the distance like malevolent stars. Tomorrow would bring violence, but tonight was for final preparations and quiet moments of truth. Samuel, Rachel said softly, if we survive this... He turned to her, seeing not just the woman he'd grown to love, but the strength she represented, the same strength he'd found in Redemption Springs. When we survive this, he corrected gently, we'll have a lot of building to do. The night settled over the town like a battle shroud, but in the darkness, hope burned as bright as the distant enemy fires. Redemption Springs prepared for war, not with the desperation of the doomed, but with the quiet certainty of those who knew exactly what they were fighting for. Dawn broke over Redemption Springs like a bruise, the sky painted in shades of purple and crimson. Samuel Thorne stood in the church tower, watching the enemy camp through Jesse's father's spyglass. The fires from last night had burned low, but he counted at least 60 riders preparing for battle. They're splitting up, he noted quietly to Sheriff Matthews. Martinez is dividing them into 4 groups. Just like you predicted, the sheriff replied. They'll hit us from multiple directions, try to stretch our defenses thin. Samuel allowed himself a grim smile. That's what they think. He'd spent 5 years building this town, knowing every beam, every foundation, every hidden weakness. Now those same buildings would become weapons. A rider emerged from the enemy camp, carrying a white flag. Even at this distance, Samuel recognized Miguel Martinez's distinctive limp. He's coming to offer one last chance to surrender, Catherine Bradford said from behind them. She'd insisted on manning the church tower as a spotter, her brothers. Rifle across her lap. No! Samuel corrected, collapsing the spyglass. He's coming to watch my face when he springs what he thinks is a surprise. He turned to Matthews. Get everyone into position. Remember, no matter what happens, nobody moves. Until they hear 3 shots. The sheriff nodded and descended the tower. Samuel made his way down to the street, where Rachel Sullivan waited with his gun belt. The children are all in the root cellar, she reported. Jesse wanted to stay and fight, but he has a more important job, Samuel assured her. Those passages we built under the town. Only someone small enough can move through them quickly. Martinez approached alone, his black horse stepping high in the morning light. He reined in at the edge of town, his silver-headed cane resting across his saddle. 1. "Last time, Phoenix," he called out. "Surrender the town, join me, and these people live." Samuel walked out to meet him, his steps unhurried. "Funny thing about surrender, Miguel. Man has to believe the threat before he gives up." Martinez smiled, but his eyes were cold. "Look around you. I have 60 men, all killers, Comanche warriors, Apache renegades, professional gunmen. What do you have? Farmers, shopkeepers, a few deputies?" "I have people fighting for their homes," Samuel replied quietly. "And something else you don't expect." "And what's that?" "A carpenter's knowledge of how things fall apart." A flash of uncertainty crossed Martinez's face, quickly hidden. "Always with the riddles, Phoenix. But while we've been talking..." He raised his hand, and suddenly hostile riders appeared on every street, emerging from hiding places they'd reached during the night. "My men have already infiltrated your precious town." Samuel didn't seem surprised. If anything, he looked pleased. "Have they now, all according to your plan?" Something in his tone made Martinez pause. He studied Samuel's face carefully, seeing not fear or resignation, but the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly how things would unfold. "What have you done?" Martinez demanded. "Built a few surprises," Samuel said simply. "You see, Miguel, a good carpenter knows that everything depends on support. Take away the right beam." He drew his gun with lightning speed, firing 3 shots into the air. The sound echoed off the buildings like thunder. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the street beneath the closest riders suddenly collapsed, dropping them into a carefully prepared pit. Similar crashes echoed through town as other trapped streets gave way. Samuel had spent months replacing key support beams with weaker wood, creating a network of controlled collapse points. "Now!" he shouted, and the town came alive with defenders. Windows that had seemed boarded up dropped open, revealing rifle barrels. Barricades that looked hastily constructed proved to be hardened fighting positions. Every building Samuel had worked on over the years had been secretly prepared for this moment. Martinez wheeled his horse, but found himself caught in a crossfire. "Kill him!" he screamed to his remaining men. "Burn it all!" The battle erupted in earnest. Gunfire filled the streets as Martinez's men tried to regroup, but everywhere they turned, they found the town itself working against them. Alleys that seemed to offer escape routes led to dead ends. Cover positions exposed them to fire from hidden spots Samuel had built into the architecture. Through it all, Samuel moved like a ghost, his gun speaking with precise authority. Every shot found its mark. Not killing, but disabling, disarming, following his old pattern of 3 shots per target. He was proving that the Phoenix hadn't lost his touch, but also that he'd grown beyond mere killing. The church. Martinez's voice carried over the chaos. "Burn the church! Break his spirit!" A group of riders charged the building, torches ready, but as they approached, the ground gave way again, another of Samuel's traps. The survivors found themselves facing Catherine Bradford and Rachel Sullivan, who had proven to be surprisingly good shots under Samuel's training. From underground passages, Jesse and other children moved unseen, passing messages and supplies. Between defenders, the town fought as one organism, using every advantage Samuel had built into it over the years. Martinez, seeing his forces crumbling, made one last desperate play. He charged straight at Samuel, firing wildly. "You should have killed me in Santa Fe!" he screamed. Samuel's response was typically precise. 3 shots rang out. The first knocked the gun from Martinez's hand, the second shattered his silver-headed O'Kane, and the third took his hat off cleanly. "I don't kill unless I have to," Samuel said quietly, as Martinez reined his panicked horse. That was true then. It's true now. The remaining attackers, seeing their leader defeated and the town's defenses unbreakable, began to surrender. Sheriff Matthews and his deputies moved in to take prisoners, while Judge Bradford read out federal warrants. Martinez sat his horse, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. "How?" he demanded. "How did you turn a whole town into a weapon?" "Not," A weapon, Samuel corrected, holstering his gun. A community, every beam, every board, every nail placed with purpose. The same way you build anything worthwhile, with care, with knowledge, and with help from people who believe in what you're building. Rachel approached, carrying Samuel's carpenter's hammer. He took it with a nod of thanks, then turned back. To Martinez, you never understood, Miguel. True strength isn't in what you can destroy. It's in what you can build, what you can protect, what you can make better. He gestured to the town around them, battered but unbroken. These people didn't just fight for their homes. They fought for each other, for something bigger than themselves. Pretty words, Martinez spat, from a man who still solved his problems with a gun. The gun was just a tool, like any other. The real weapon was knowledge, knowing how things work, how they break, how they stand. Samuel smiled slightly. Even knowing how a man who learns to walk with a cane shifts his weight before he draws. As if to prove his point, Martinez suddenly reached for a hidden derringer. But before he could grab it, Samuel's hammer flashed out, striking his hand with Carpenter's precision. The tiny gun fell harmlessly to the dust. That's the difference between us, Samuel said, as deputies moved to take Martinez into custody. You never learned that true power isn't in destroying what others build. It's in building something so strong that destruction becomes impossible. The sun had climbed higher, burning away the morning mist along with the gun smoke. Throughout Redemption Springs, people emerged from their fighting positions, helping wounded enemies as readily as friends. The battle was over, but the real work, the work of building and rebuilding, was just beginning. Rachel touched Samuel's arm gently. The church altar still needs finishing, she reminded him with a smile. He looked at the building, scarred but standing like the town itself. Yes, he agreed. But this time, I think we'll build it together, all of us, because that was the final lesson Samuel Thorne had learned, that the strongest things aren't built by one man alone, but by a community working towards something greater than themselves. Even the Phoenix had needed to learn that sometimes the most powerful act isn't rising from the ashes, but preventing the fire in the first place. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the newly repaired church windows as Samuel Thorne fitted the final piece of the altar into place. 1 week had passed since the battle, and Redemption Springs was already transforming. What had begun as repairs were becoming improvements, the town growing stronger, like a broken bone that heals thicker than before. Perfect fit, Jesse observed from his position as assistant. The boy had barely left Samuel's side since the fighting ended. Rachel. Sullivan appeared in the church doorway carrying a telegram. News from the territorial capital, she announced. The governor's approved Judge Bradford's recommendations. Redemption Springs is being made the county seat. There's more, she continued. They're establishing a ranger training program here. Want to teach other towns how to defend themselves. They're asking you to run it. Samuel drove another nail home, considering the idea. Might be better to find someone else. Man with my history is exactly what they need, Catherine Bradford interrupted, entering with her husband. Someone who understands both sides of the law. Someone who knows that real justice isn't just about being fast with a gun. The sound of horses outside drew their attention. Sheriff Matthews entered, looking concerned. Riders coming in from the south. Looked like gunmen, but Samuel didn't reach for his weapon. Instead, he smiled. Right on time. Outside, 5 riders approached the church. Their leader, Bill Hawkins, once one of the deadliest guns in Kansas territory, carried a carpenter's plane across his saddle. Heard the Phoenix was teaching more than just shooting these days, Hawkins called out. Thought maybe there was room for some old dogs to learn new tricks. Over the next hours, more riders arrived. Former lawmen, reformed outlaws, even tribal warriors. Each came seeking something they'd heard about, a place where the gun and the hammer worked together, where justice was built rather than imposed. As the sun began to set, Rachel found Samuel at his workbench, sketching plans for expanding. "The church, happy?" she asked softly. He looked up, taking in the scene. Jessie teaching younger children woodworking, Catherine and Judge Bradford discussing plans for a courthouse, former enemies working together to raise a new barn. "Satisfied," he replied. "Still, got work to do, but the foundation's solid." Later that night, Samuel stood in the church tower with Jessie, watching the stars emerge. "Mr. Thorne," the boy asked, "think we'll ever have to fight like that again?" "Hope not," Samuel replied, "but if we do, we'll be ready. Not just with guns, but with something stronger, a community that knows how to stand together, how to build together." He pulled his father's watch from his pocket, running his thumb over the inscription. "When to stand and when to walk away," he read aloud. "Took me a long time to understand. Sometimes you can do both at once. Stand for what's right by walking away from what's easy." The night air carried the sounds of the growing town. Laughter. From the saloon, hammer strikes from late workers, hymns being practiced for Sunday. Not just a settlement anymore, but a symbol of what the frontier could become when people chose to build something together. Samuel Thorne, once known as the Phoenix, now known simply as the Carpenter of Redemption Springs, smiled as he pocketed his father's watch. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build, but tonight he was exactly where he needed to be. A builder of futures, a teacher of hope, a man who had finally learned that the strongest weapon isn't a gun or even a hammer, but the willingness to create something larger than yourself. And in that truth, both the Phoenix and the Carpenter found their final redemption.